friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with my October reading wrap up. According to Goodreads, I read 16 books this month, which I think is quite nice. It was quite a mixture, I would say, of different books. I read non-fiction, I read literary fiction, I read some children's books, I read some comics, so it's quite mixed this month. The first book that I read this month was A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, and I picked this up at the library not knowing anything about it. I picked up the Dutch translation because that's what they had at the library, and I was just like, the cover just made me curious. I'd never heard of the story before. Apparently it was nominated for the Booker Prize, so it's definitely like a relatively well-known book, I would say, but I had never heard of it before. It just looked interesting, and like it was in the end, I think, very much what I expected from it, like a not necessarily slow read, but just like one of those books where not necessarily a lot happens, you just spend some kind of pleasant time with the characters. It's about a man who is a veteran of the First World War, and after the war he goes to this village in Yorkshire, I believe, and he goes there to restore a painting in a church, and like slowly he just kind of becomes involved in village life. There's not really a lot that happens in this book. There's just like some encounters between the characters and like some speculation about like relationships between different characters, but in reality not a lot actually happens. I didn't necessarily mind that, but it also wasn't really a book that's going to stay with me, I think. Yeah, it was just one of those books that it's just nice to read if you want to be somewhere else for a little while, and it's very short, so I think that helps. If this had been a really long book, I think I might have become bored after a while, but because it's so short, I think it's a novella. It was just interesting, like, and it was just nice spending like sort of it does very much feel like a summer read, like just spending a quiet summer afternoon in the country. It was a really pleasant read, but it's just because not a lot happened, I don't think this is going to stay with me. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily, like, I gave this 3 stars on Goodreads. I'm wondering now if that was perhaps a little bit low. Maybe I should have given it 4, but I don't know. I do think it's a book that I will quickly kind of forget about, but it's not necessarily a book that I wouldn't recommend to people. I can definitely see why people would love this. Next, I finished a graphic novel called Brooms by Jasmine Walls and Oude. And this is a story that's set in the 1930s in Mississippi, and there is magic in this world. It's kind of about a family and a group of friends in a way, and there are these 2 young girls. They are Black and Choctaw, and they recently they've started to notice that they have gotten like magical abilities, but in this time and place, it's illegal for maybe for Black people or just people of color in general. I'm not entirely sure, but at least for Black people, it's illegal to use magic. So the family is kind of trying to protect them because these kids will probably have to be sent to, at least according to the government, they have to be sent to a residential school. And there's like another young woman in the family who went to these residential schools, and she kind of had like a really horrible experience there, and she was stripped of her powers. So the family is trying to avoid that this will happen to the girls as well. And one way that they can do that is to pay a lot of money so that they don't have to go to one of these schools, but they don't have a lot of money. So yeah, the story is about the girls and like some family members and some of their friends trying to train the girls for participating in broom races, so that they can win prize money, so that they can pay off like some officials, I guess. So it's mostly about the training and the broom races, which are illegal, by the way, these broom races. I really enjoyed this. It's a very diverse cast of characters. There are Black characters, Choctaw. I think one of the characters, I believe she is Korean American, at least she's Asian American. I think she was Korean American, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. There is a trans character, there is a sapphic relationship in this story, there is also a character with a physical disability, so there's lots of different representation. I also felt like the representation was done really well, like for a lot of these identities, like it was there, but it wasn't necessarily the focus of the story, and there wasn't really a lot of, I don't think there was any homophobia or transphobia or like ableism in this story, so it's just nice to just see a story in that time period where it was included and wasn't necessarily an issue. But yeah, as I mentioned before, it is very much a racist society, so racism is something that does come up in the story that you should maybe be aware of that you're going into this. I thought it was a really interesting world. This is a kind of standalone graphic novel, and I think I would have even enjoyed it more if it had been like a short series maybe, because I would love to see a little bit more about how this world was organized, because they mention like that the situation in Mississippi in particular is quite bad, but then in other places it's a little bit different, and there's like more rights for Black people. So I think I would have liked to see more of that, and just how that works with not just historical events, I guess, but how also like the magic and that aspect of the story fits in with like historical events, I guess. I think it would also have been fun to see a little bit more of this like illegal broom racing sort of underground thing. I think that would have been really interesting, but overall I really enjoyed it. I thought the characters were really interesting, and something I really appreciated in this story was that like sometimes the characters have very much conflicting interests. Like sometimes like at some point there is a race, and it would have been really helpful if one of the characters is also there, but she kind of has her own stuff going on. And I appreciated that like a lot of the other characters kind of could understand that, even though it was like would be better for themselves if she was there, like they also understood that she had other things going on in her life. And I just felt like all these characters in this story were just very understanding towards each other, and just not judging that sometimes someone else has to make a choice that's kind of contrary to what is beneficial to you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, they don't love you, they don't care about you. And it was just really nice to see that without like any miscommunication. Yeah, it's definitely one that I would recommend if you are in the mood for some broom racing. Next, I finished a very big Dutch literary fiction book that's called Het lied van ooievaar en dromedaris, or in English that would be The Song of Stork and Dromedary. Kind of a random title, but it does come up in the story eventually. This is a Dutch book that has won a couple of prizes, and I feel like this might be one of the literary fiction books on Goodreads, at least the Dutch literary fiction books, that has one of the highest ratings, because a lot of Dutch books on Goodreads have very low ratings, I find. This one has like, what is it? Yeah, this one has like a 4.4 average on Goodreads, which for a Dutch book I feel like is very high, and I've mostly seen 4 and 5 stars from people I know. But I personally have very mixed feelings about this book. This is a book that is kind of inspired by Emily Bronte, who wrote the book Wuthering Heights, and that's kind of a like fictional author in this book who is very similar to Emily Bronte in a way. I meant to like look up more about her life so that I could maybe see more of the parallels in the story, but I haven't done that so far. But yeah, I've definitely, from the little I know of Emily Bronte, there's definitely like some parallels that I've seen. So that was really interesting. But this book is definitely quite different from a lot of Dutch fiction, because it is historical fiction, sort of. It is about this fictional author, Eliza May Drayden, she's called in the book, and it's about her, but it's never told from her perspective. You kind of read 11 stories throughout time. The first one is The Longest Ago, and then it kind of moves throughout time towards like present day almost. And these are all stories about people who have in some way interacted with Eliza May Drayden or her books, or there's like some sort of connection somewhere. And this book is over 600 pages, so initially I was very intimidated, but I was surprised at like how quickly I felt immersed in the story. It definitely initially had that kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit of a similar vibe to some classic British stories that I've read, which I really enjoyed. So the first couple stories I really enjoyed, and in those stories there was often a much clearer relationship between the main characters of those stories and the author Eliza May Drayden, and I liked kind of seeing that come together. And because the book is very much like, there's a lot of themes going on, there's a lot of death involved, and like belief, and what do you believe, and whether you're religious or not, but also what do you believe to be true, and how do you experience events, and how is history written. All these things kind of come up, and it was initially very interesting to see how kind of the characters constructed a narrative based on the things they experienced. But then you read other stories later on and you kind of realize that some of the things that these people in earlier stories thought was happening wasn't actually true, like something else was going on. And I thought that was really interesting how that started to come together the more stories you read. But then kind of halfway through I started enjoying it a lot less, because it started on the one hand to become a little bit more predictable, because you're reading these 11 stories of people that are somehow have a connection with Eliza May Drayden, but you also pretty much always you would follow the character's life like from birth till death, and not all the stories were equally interesting. So sometimes I felt like I didn't necessarily want to read their entire life story, and I knew from earlier stories that it was going to continue till they died. So yeah, there were definitely stories I was wondering, like, when is this person going to die? Like, when are we getting to the next story that will maybe be more interesting? And another reason that I found it to become less interesting over time was because the kind of relationship between the characters and the author was becoming kind of vaguer and vaguer, and it was much more about themes that came up in the author's life and then in the main characters of the short stories. And more towards the end I just started to feel like this was a collection of like themes and symbolism that was coming up, but it just didn't really go anywhere. And you know, I think I've seen some people mention like how they felt like everything came together in the end, and I just felt very much the opposite. Like, I was very frustrated with the end. Like, it was just, I was hoping for it to come together. Like, I couldn't really see how it would come together, but I was still hoping that was going to happen, because otherwise it just felt so pointless. And in the end I just really didn't feel like it came together. One of the very few critical reviews that I've read did mention, and I agree very much with that, they mentioned that it's a lot easier to create chaos than it is to like let everything come together in a really like well thought out way. And I very much agree with that. And I just felt like the chaos at the end of this book just felt very easy. Also because the last story is about quantum mechanics, and I've seen someone mention like how they were like, oh, I'm really surprised that this was about quantum mechanics, and it was like such a pleasant surprise. But it just felt like a really easy way to sort of try to make the book have more of a literary quality or something. Like, just throw in some really difficult topic that a lot of people are not going to understand, and then just because it's complicated you're going to throw people off and they're going to think that it's a very complicated book. But in the end I just felt like she didn't do anything interesting with the story, like with the quantum mechanics in relation to the story. It just felt quite kind of predictable. Like, if I read the first half of the book and then someone who would have told me that at the end like quantum mechanics would be thrown in, this is kind of the sort of thing that I would expect. I didn't think it was anything interesting at all, the ending. So I have very mixed feelings. Like, I really enjoyed it in the beginning, but then the ending, it just really had me mad. Like, I was staying with my parents at the time that I finished it, and I just ranted to my mother about this book because I just had to talk to someone and like, you know, explain my frustrations about this book. And I'm very curious to see if there are like more people who agree, who didn't love this story, because I just feel like I'm one of the very few people who just didn't love this. I do think, so far, I don't think this has been translated into English, but I do think it would be an interesting book to translate into English, for one, because it's very different from a lot of other Dutch literature, but I also think because of the subject, a lot of people would find it interesting. And I can definitely see why other people would like this. I just didn't like it, the ending at least. And next, I read a memoir. I read Pageboy by Elliot Page. He's a trans actor who came out with trans like last year, or the year before. No, I think it was last year. Or it was, yeah, probably last year. And I'm usually not super into like memoirs by actors. I'm not really a fan of actors. Usually not really my thing. But I was really interested to read Elliot Page's memoir, both because it was a memoir by a trans person and I just want to read more of those. But also I think it's interesting to read about kind of transitioning when you are like in the public eye so much, and like especially in the film industry. So I was very intrigued. I did already read, like before I picked this up, I did already read quite mixed reviews. Like some people loved it, some people didn't like it. So I was already aware that like it was loved all around. But yeah, I can definitely see both sides to it, because the book is kind of structured not chronologically, and while that is something I guess I do usually prefer, if it's structured around themes, or like there's a much stronger connection between the events that are told, I don't necessarily mind when something is told not linearly. But in this book I definitely felt that it was very disjointed, and I didn't always understand like what age exactly Elliot was when a particular situation happens, because sometimes I would read something and I would be, whoa, what just happened? But then I realized, oh, he's not actually 7 in this situation, he's probably more like 17 at this point, and then it made more sense for the things that happened. So that was a little bit confusing sometimes. What I thought was really interesting was, yeah, what I mentioned before, kind of seeing what it's like, not necessarily like being a trans person in the film industry, because that's something that only, like Elliot's trans identity only comes up really towards the end of the memoir. It wasn't really discussed very in depth, I felt like, so that wasn't really the focus. But there was a lot of focus on being queer in the film industry, because like first he was kind of perceived as a lesbian woman, and I did think that was really interesting to read about, like what that like would have felt like. Yeah, it's definitely not a situation I would have liked to be in, but it was really interesting. But I think also what I maybe even thought was more interesting was how I kind of, from the few interviews that I've seen with him in the past, I did kind of had this image in my head of what he would be like as a person, and just his memoir was so different. And I think it was really interesting because it kind of like confirmed again what the book was also saying, like how the film industry very much creates this image of characters, what they're like, but it's just not necessarily reflective of reality. And while I thought that would have been more clear in his, like when it came to like his queer or trans identity, I also kind of saw that in his like personality from interviews. I just thought he would have had a different personality that really, yeah, showing through in the book. So I did think that was really interesting. This is definitely a book that deals with a lot of trauma, so don't read this when you're not in a good place. There's a lot of homophobia, there's a lot, yeah, there's like internalized transphobia mostly, I think. And then also just, yeah, like inappropriate stuff that happens on set and other places as well, to Elliot. So if you need like trigger warnings, that's definitely something to look up for this book, because it does feel like very heavy in places, and lots of like terrible things happen to Elliot. Also in relation to his father and stepmother, and kind of like not really growing up in a safe place necessarily. So it wasn't a very happy book. I am glad I read it because I thought it was interesting, and it just kind of once again just like made so many issues like in the film industry but also outside of that clear. So I do think it's like on the one hand an important read, but I also don't necessarily feel like this was maybe the right time for the book to be published. The events in this book were very disjointed, and I can imagine that in Elliot's mind these events are very connected, and like certain memories spurred on certain other memories. But as a reader, it just was kind of a messy reading experience. I can imagine that it would have been really cathartic to write this, so like put it all out on paper, but as a reader I'm not really sure what I was supposed to get out of it as a reader. So I ended up giving this 3 stars on Goodreads. It's not a terrible book, it's just I don't think it was really written at the right time. I think maybe if Elliot would have had a little bit more time after like transitioning in the public eye to kind of reflect on that, I think it would have been a little bit more interesting, and maybe like some more editing rounds as well. But I would mostly recommend this, I think, if you are particularly interested in Elliot Page as an actor or person, and yeah, not necessarily if you want to read this as a memoir of a trans person, because that's kind of why I picked it up for a large part, and that wasn't actually a very large part of the memoir itself. Next, I read another Dutch book, which was called Oude met autisme, or in English, Old Lady with Autism. This hasn't been translated or anything, but I thought this was quite an interesting book. It's a memoir about by a woman who was diagnosed with autism at age 65, I believe. So I mostly thought this was really interesting to read, like from the perspective of someone who is a lot older, because some of the other memoirs by autistic people that I've read are usually younger people. So that was mostly why I thought this was interesting. It was, I think, self-published, or like, yeah, maybe published by some small publisher, I think, but I think it was self-published, and I do feel like you could see that like some more editing would have been nice. And it is a memoir, but it's also kind of interspersed with blocks of information about autism, and I just didn't really agree with everything that was mentioned in those information blocks, and it was just some like outdated theories that were mentioned, so I didn't love that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this if you want to learn more about autism, but if you're specifically interested in reading the story of someone who was diagnosed when they were a lot older. I think she was only diagnosed when she was already retired, so I think that was a really interesting part, and if you're specifically interested in that, I do think it's an interesting read. Then I read a graphic novel adaptation of Wuthering Height by Alice McCarthy and Naresh Kumar, and this was really nice actually. When I like selected this for my autumn TBR, I was kind of interested to see how this would read, because the cover like has a lot of pastel colors on it, and also in some of the illustrations when I flipped through it seemed very light for such a gloomy story that Wuthering Heights is. But when I actually read this, it did feel kind of appropriate. Like I didn't feel like the colors were too light, and there were actually a lot more darker panels as well than I saw when flipping through it initially. But it seemed to kind of fit with the characters, perhaps. Like the main character, Catherine, I think like at some times she appears really nice, but then she isn't, and I kind of felt like that sort of juxtaposition between kind of pastel colors and the darker colors kind of worked with that sort of there's different attitudes of the characters like that weren't really consistent, so I didn't really mind the colors in the end. The artwork wasn't the best, I would say. I liked it. It was mostly the faces that were a bit awkwardly drawn. Like I definitely had a few times where I had to go back and see if the character that I was looking at in a particular panel was like a different character or if it was still the same, because sometimes they seemed kind of old and then they seemed young and then they seemed old, and it just was a bit inconsistent, but it wasn't like a terrible art style. And I think this is definitely quite faithful to the original story from what I remember it, at least. Like, it's been a few years since I read Wuthering Height, but it definitely touched on the most important parts of the story, I think, and I actually liked it in graphic novel format, maybe even more than the actual book, because the actual book is much longer and it's about all these horrible people. And while I think the story is interesting, it's not necessarily like the characters aren't pleasant, and I think that bothers me a little bit more when the book is very long, but because the graphic novel is quite short, you can just read it in one sitting and yeah, I don't know, like experience the story more as an outsider maybe, but in this case I like that. I find it difficult to explain, but it's definitely one of those graphic novels that I can see myself picking up again when I'm like sort of in the mood for a gloomy story. It's definitely one that I see myself picking up again maybe next year. So if you are already like a fan of the story, or like if you enjoyed it at least, and would like to read it in graphic novel format, this is one I would recommend. Then I read another Dutch book, a non-fiction book called Vonken in the meterkast, and this is basically a book about electricity and the brain, and I thought it explained a lot of concepts really well. Like, I was kind of transported back to my high school days where we talked about like the nervous system and electricity, and I just felt like this book explained certain concepts that in class we discussed over like several weeks. This book just explained them in one paragraph, so I think the book did that really well. It was more about electricity than I thought it would be. Like, the title, I took it less literally, like Vonken in the title literally means sparks, but I just interpreted that as like stuff that goes wrong in the brain. I thought it would be more about a little bit more about psychology. Like, I had expected some neuroscience, but it's definitely very much more about electricity. Like, they explain literally how electricity works. So that was a little bit different from what I was expecting, but it's definitely a good like popular science book, I would say. There were quite a lot of like spelling errors, and I borrowed this from the library, so at some points someone had actually started like correcting the spelling mistakes, so changed like D's for T's and stuff. I thought that was quite funny. Next I read The Ghost of Gosswater by Lucy Strange. This is a children's book, and it's kind of like, it's a historical setting, kind of gothic. That's at least what the description on Goodreads says. And it's about a girl who, I think her dad is an earl, but then he dies. Like, her mother's already died a few years ago, and then she finds out that she isn't actually their biological child, and she's sent to live with her biological father. And while a cousin of hers like gets the estate that she used to live in. The story's kind of about the girl sort of finding out her true identity. There is a sort of ghost involved. Yeah, it was a little bit different from what I was expecting. I thought the ghost would play a much larger role in this story. Like, it was there, but just it didn't really play such a big role. And I felt like this was explained as like a gothic story, but it felt more fairy tale like to me in places. Like, maybe I'm just being too critical of a children's book, but it wasn't as scary as I was expecting it to be. I thought like there were some like parts of the story that felt, at least for a children's book, like somewhat scary, but especially the ending of the book felt a little bit cartoonish. Like, the cousin that ended up getting the estate after the main character's father died, he just felt like such a cartoonish bad guy, that I just had kind of a hard time taking him seriously. And one of the things that comes up in this book is a sort of like gem or jewel, I don't remember exactly, that has disappeared. There's one that has disappeared, and the other one, the main character has stolen from her cousin because she kind of feels like she's entitled to have something when she's lost the estate. And it just seemed a little odd to me. Like, she was a 12-year-old girl and she seemed very obsessed with this gem. I just found it strange that like a 12-year-old girl would be thinking so much about like such a expensive gem that it just seemed strange. I was just, as a reader, never really convinced about why she cared so much about this jewel. Like, I would have expected her to care more about the fact that she was driven from the home that she grew up in, but that didn't really come up a lot. And just in general, this story felt like, I liked it. There were definitely parts that I liked, but it felt very, it felt like it was told in a very linear way. Like, one thing happened after the other, and I would have just liked a little bit more like foreshadowing, some clues beforehand, because now a lot of the time it seemed like something only came up when it was relevant. Like, at some point in the story, the main character mentioned like something that her father said right before he died, but I just wish as a reader that we had heard that a lot earlier and not when it was relevant, because then it just seems like the writer has just come up with it at the spot. Like, she thought like, oh, I actually should have included this, let me just include this now. That's kind of what it felt like. Yeah, if you enjoy like a not too scary children's mystery, I can definitely see how people would enjoy this. Then I listened to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. This is such a famous classic, but I've never actually read the original story. I've seen like film adaptations, but now having like heard the actual story, I'm kind of surprised, because film adaptations that I've seen like very much focus on the headless horseman part, like the actual legend of this town. But then the story that I now listen to, it focused a lot about the characters and village life, and you know, at the end of the story the actual legend is sort of told, but it didn't feel really scary at all, and it just felt more like village gossip almost. So it was just very different from what I was expecting. I do think it was interesting because it's such a famous classic to finally know the true story. But yeah, I'm just surprised like how movie adaptations make this so very different from what it actually is in the story. I'm sure pretty much everyone is familiar with the story, but it's about Ichabod Crane, who is a teacher in a village, and he learns about this sort of legend of a headless horseman that rides around the country at night sometimes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as like a scary read or really a Halloween read. I would more so recommend this if you're like interested in sort of village life and kind of sort of the social commentary on that, because I did feel like the narrator was kind of poking fun at the characters in some way. Like in some other film adaptations that I've seen, Ichabod Crane is like truly in love with this other character, but in the story it very much becomes clear that he's mostly just interested in the fact that she's from a rich family and she'll inherit a lot of land. So I did think it was interesting in terms of social commentary. So if that's something you might enjoy, I do think this could be a fun read. Then I read Slow Down by Rachel Williams and Freya Hartes, and this is sort of a graphic novel that's a short story collection. Like, they are all non-fiction stories that are like 2 pages long, and they just are about like very everyday small things that happen in nature. Like there is a story about a bee pollinating a flower. There is a story, I think, about how clouds form. So like just kind of appreciating the small things in life, and I think that concept was really nice. I personally think I read this too quickly, definitely for a book that's called Slow Down. You can read it very quickly. I read it in like 2 or 3 days. I don't think you should do that. I think you should indeed slow down and like read as much slower, like maybe one or two of these stories each day to like fully appreciate them. But if you like nature and you do sort of want to appreciate the small things in life, I do think it's really a beautiful book, especially the illustrations. They are absolutely gorgeous, and there were definitely some panels that I would have just liked as a poster to put up on my wall or something. And then towards the end of the month, I finished Clockwork Prince by Cassandra Clare, which is the second book in the Infernal Devices series. I've read some of the books in the Mortal Instruments series, which are set in kind of the same world, and while I don't necessarily think those are the best fantasy books ever, I did really enjoy them. So I picked this trilogy up because I was feeling like a kind of like easy YA fantasy read, but it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I think one of my main problems with this series so far is that I'm not really invested in the overarching story. I feel like the villain seems very cartoonesque, and it's just not a sort of story that I really enjoy. So already in the first book, I didn't love it. I still gave it 3 stars because there were some elements that I liked. I think the main character is quite nice. I liked her more than Clary in the Mortal Instruments. I found her quite annoying, but I feel like Tessa, the main character in this series, is more likable and does just a lot less stupid things. Like she does put herself in danger sometimes, but I just felt like it made more sense. So that was something I appreciated here. But the overarching plot of the trilogy is just not my favorite, and I would have liked the individual books to also kind of have a more like overarching story contained within the book, so to say. Because I was kind of surprised when the first book sort of ended. It felt a little bit random, and I had the same with the second book. Like I kind of expected it this time, and I knew that the overarching plot wasn't going to be solved in this book, but it just still felt like a bit of an arbitrary ending. And there's also something that happens at the end of the second book that very much felt like it was just thrown in for shock value so that you would continue to read. But then my main issue with this series that was more prominent in this second book is the love triangle. I'm sure that if you've heard about the series before, you already know that there's 2 boys, Will and Jem, and like they're both interested in Tessa, and I just don't like her relationship with either of them. With Jem, I just never really felt the chemistry. I just felt like she was just being nice to him and she just liked the attention. Like I never really felt like she was actually interested in him in a romantic way. But the most frustrating part was definitely her relationship with Will, because at the end of the first book something happens, like he kind of pushes her away, and while I get that that would make her somewhat hesitant to believe that, you know, he would be interested in her, in his second book it just feels like you are being hit over the head constantly with like signs that he does actually like her, and also you read from his perspective as well, so as a reader you are so much very aware that he does like her. And I just felt like hint after hint was being given and she would still be like, no, he can't possibly care about me. No, that can't be the case. Something else must be going. It must be something else why he's suddenly being so nice to me. And it just had me rolling my eyes so many times. It was just getting so annoying. That was definitely the most frustrating part about this book. And I just feel like I would have preferred this book more if there just hadn't been any romance in it, even though I'm not generally someone that's against romance in books or anything. But despite the things I didn't like about this book, I am still considering picking up the third book or maybe listening to it on audiobook because it's such a long book and I don't know if it's going to hold my attention, so maybe I should just listen to it on audiobook while I'm making like a jigsaw puzzle or something. I am still curious, mostly because it's like I already read 2/3 of the trilogy. I'm almost done, so I am still thinking that maybe I should just finish the story, then at least I know what's going to happen next. And I do find the Shadowhunter world interesting. This is just not my favorite series in that world, I would say. Then the last book I read in October was Ghosts by Raina Telgemeier. I read this on Halloween. And this is a graphic novel about a girl called Kat, and her sister Maya is sick, and because of that her family moves to a different coastal town, and she's not happy at all about the move. She doesn't like it there, and then people in this town are talking a lot about ghosts, and she doesn't believe it initially, she doesn't like it. And it's kind of about her relationship with those ghosts and how that changes and how she sort of starts to feel at home in this new town, I guess. While I read this, I did enjoy it, but afterwards, when I went on Goodreads and read some reviews, I saw that there were some issues pointed out by people. Because initially, before reading this, I thought that the author was actually Mexican American herself, because it talks about the Day of the Dead in this book, and there's like other Mexican influences as well. But yeah, the author isn't actually Mexican American herself. So some other people have pointed out some issues with like the way the Day of the Dead is represented, and also why the ghost story necessarily isn't very appropriate. Also because at one point the characters go to a mission, and this is a place where there are a lot of ghosts, and some people mentioned that the story kind of completely disregard kind of the horrible history that would have happened at a place like that, like the reason why so many people died there, and it just kind of doesn't discuss that. That was one of the issues. And also in the story it's mentioned that those ghosts like it if you speak Spanish to them, but then some reviewers pointed out that that didn't make any sense, because to the people that would have been buried there or died there, like Spanish would likely have been kind of the language of their oppressors. So yeah, there are some issues with this book that I didn't know about, so I'm glad that some other people pointed those out. So while I like the artwork and the relationship between the two sisters, I guess this is one maybe to skip. I know the author has some other books as well. I still have another comic by her. I think it's called Sisters, and that is not about Mexican American culture, so I'm hoping that one is going to be fine. But yeah, this one is maybe one to skip. These were all the books that I read in October. Like, talking about them, it just feels like I really read a lot. I would love to hear in the comments what your favorite book was that you read in October, and maybe I'll see you in another video. Bye!